Consider this: 2,000 years ago, one of history's greatest minds, Marcus Aurelius, stood at the helm of the Roman Empire, facing chaos, war, and uncertainty. Yet in his private writings, he penned these words: "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That simple but profound idea didn't just steady his own spirit. It became the invisible glue holding an empire together. Today, we've forgotten so many of these mental frameworks, the quiet disciplines, the unspoken codes that once allowed ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things. But what if I told you these ancient principles aren't relics of the past? They're hidden levers still within reach, waiting to be rediscovered. Think about the last time you faced a challenge that felt overwhelming, maybe a personal setback, a professional hurdle, or even just the daily grind wearing you down. Now imagine having access to the same mental tools that guided leaders, builders, and thinkers who shaped civilizations. That's the power of Stoicism, not as some dusty philosophy, but as a living, breathing toolkit for resilience. These forgotten frameworks weren't just about enduring hardship. They were about forging unity, clarity, and purpose in a fractured world. And here's the surprising truth: they work just as well today as they did in the halls of ancient Rome or the Stoic courts of Marcus Aurelius. So why have we let them fade away? Maybe it's because modern life moves too fast, or because we've traded depth for convenience. But what if reclaiming even a handful of these principles could change how you approach your struggles, your goals, your relationships? Over the next 20 minutes, we're going to uncover 20 of these lost mental frameworks, each one a piece of the puzzle that once held empires together. And by the end, I'll leave you with a question. What could you build, what could you withstand, if you had the same mindsets that turned ordinary individuals into architects of history? Empires thrived by focusing only on what they could control. This wasn't just strategy, it was survival. The Stoics called it the Dichotomy of Control, and it was the first mental framework that separated the builders of civilizations from those crushed by chaos. Picture Epictetus, a former slave turned philosopher, teaching Rome's elite with one brutal truth: some things are within our power while others are not. He wasn't just talking about philosophy, he was giving them the operating system for leadership. Rome didn't waste energy raging against barbarian invasions or bad harvests. Instead, they fortified their borders, improved supply lines, and trained their legions, focusing relentlessly on what they could influence. Now think about your own life. How often do you exhaust yourself worrying about outcomes you can't change? The traffic, the weather, someone else's opinion. These are modern-day barbarians at the gate. But here's what the Stoics understood. The more you fixate on the uncontrollable, the less energy you have for the things that actually shape your destiny. Rome's leaders didn't pray for the Nile to flood. They built granaries. They didn't blame the gods for defeat. They analyzed their tactics. That shift from frustration to agency was their secret. So ask yourself today, where are you pouring effort into things that will never bend to your will? And what would happen if you redirected that focus? The dichotomy of control isn't about giving up. It's about channeling your power where it counts. Because empires weren't built by those who hoped for calm seas. They were built by those who learned to sail in any storm. Seneca, the great Stoic philosopher and advisor to Emperor Nero, had a daily ritual that might shock modern minds. He would deliberately imagine the worst possible scenarios. Losing his wealth, his status, even his family. This wasn't pessimism. It was a mental drill called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, and it wasn't just philosophers who used it. Hannibal, the legendary Carthaginian general, didn't just cross the Alps with elephants for spectacle. He spent years envisioning every possible disaster: avalanches, ambushes, supply shortages, and crafted solutions before they happened. That's how 26,000 men defied an empire. Here's the paradox: by mentally rehearsing failure, these leaders stripped fear of its power. When disaster struck, they weren't paralyzed, they were prepared. Seneca wrote, "The man who has anticipated the coming of troubles takes away their power when they arrive." Contrast that with how most of us operate today. We avoid thinking about job loss, health crises, or relationship breakdowns until they blindside us, leaving us scrambling. But what if you could face life's uncertainties with the same calm as a Stoic or the precision of a general? Take a moment to reflect. When was the last time you truly prepared for something going wrong? Not anxious worrying, but deliberate planning. If your car broke down tomorrow, do you have an emergency fund? If a project failed, would you know your next move? Premeditatio malorum isn't about expecting doom. It's about reclaiming agency. The Roman Senate didn't wait for famine to stockpile grain. Navy SEAL don't wait for combat to practice contingency drills. They all understand resilience isn't born in the crisis, it's built in the quiet moments before. So try this tonight. Spend 5 minutes imagining a challenge you fear. Play it out in detail, not to dwell, but to disarm it. What's your first step if it happens? Your backup plan. That mental rehearsal is the difference between panic and poise. Because history shows us again and again, the people who thrive aren't those with the fewest problems, but those who have already walked through them in their minds. Centuries after the Stoics, Friedrich Nietzsche would echo one of their most powerful ideas with 3 Latin words: amor fati, love of fate. But this wasn't just philosophy, it was the mindset that allowed empires to turn setbacks into stepping stones. Picture Marcus Aurelius on the Danube frontier, writing by torchlight as his legions battled plague and invasion. His words, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." While lesser leaders cursed their misfortunes, he embraced them as fuel. Rome didn't conquer the Mediterranean by avoiding storms, they became better sailors. This is where modern minds often stumble. We treat fate like an opponent, resisting every unexpected turn. A missed promotion, a failed relationship, even a rainy day. We rail against them as if life owes us perfect conditions. But the Stoics and the empires they guided saw differently. When Carthage burned, Rome didn't mourn, they rebuilt stronger ports. When barbarians breached the walls, they didn't despair, they engineered better defenses. Amor fati wasn't passive acceptance, it was active alchemy transforming adversity into advantage. Marcus Aurelius left us a clue in his private journals: accept whatever comes to you woven in the pattern of your destiny. What if you applied that to your life right now? That job rejection, that health scare, that financial pinch, what if they weren't roadblocks but redirections? The Persians had a saying, "This too shall shape you." Not just pass, but shape, because history's great builders understood. Destiny isn't what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens. So here's a challenge. Pick one difficulty you're facing today and ask, not "Why is this happening to me?" but "Why is this happening for me?" The entrepreneur whose bankruptcy taught frugality, the athlete whose injury forced smarter training, even the oak tree grows stronger against the wind. Amor fati whispers, the obstacle is the way, and once you hear it, you'll start seeing proof everywhere, from the empires that rose through chaos to the lives that find meaning in the storm. Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, stood in the heart of Athens teaching a radical idea that every person, every city, every empire was bound together by an invisible thread called sympatheia. He called it the breath of the universe, the understanding that we're all part of a single, interconnected whole. Rome didn't just conquer with swords, they built an empire that lasted centuries by weaving this principle into their laws, their roads, even their pantheon of gods. When they granted citizenship to conquered peoples, when they built aqueducts that served rich and poor alike, they were acting on a truth we've forgotten. Strength comes not from division, but from deliberate unity. Centuries later, the Stoic philosopher Hierocles gave us a tangible way to practice this. He described empathy as a series of concentric circles, with yourself at the center, then family, friends, community, and finally strangers at the outermost edge. The goal, to gradually draw those outer circles inward, treating neighbors like friends, foreigners like countrymen. Imagine if Rome had hoarded its technology, its citizenship, its culture. Instead, they spread their roads, their language, their legal systems not just to control, but to connect. That's how you turn conquest into cohesion. Now look at our world today. How often do we do the opposite? We build digital walls between ideologies. We dismiss entire groups as other. We retreat into smaller and smaller circles of concern. Yet history shows us the cost of that fragmentation. Rome didn't fall because of external invaders alone. It crumbled when it lost that binding sense of shared destiny. The Stoics would argue that your personal resilience, your success, even your happiness are tied to how widely you cast your circle of empathy. So here's a challenge. Think of someone just outside your current circle of concern, a coworker you barely speak to, a neighbor from a different background, even a societal group you've unconsciously dismissed. What's one small step to bring them closer? Maybe it's a conversation, a shared project, or simply questioning your own assumptions. Sympatheia isn't about grand gestures, it's the daily practice of recognizing yourself in others. Because empires weren't sustained by force, they thrived when people believed they were part of something larger. And isn't that the same glue that holds families, teams, and communities together today? Death shaped empires, not as an end, but as the ultimate focusing lens. The Stoic generals who marched under Rome's eagle standards carried a mental framework so potent it could turn boys into legends and hesitation into decisive action. Memento Mori, the remembrance of death. But this wasn't about fear, it was about clarity. When the great Cato the Younger faced impossible odds in battle, he didn't rally his troops with promises of eternal glory. He reminded them they were already mortal, and in that stark truth, they found the courage to act as if this day were their last, because one day it would be. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, scribbled in his private journal a question that still echoes: you could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. Imagine ruling an empire with that awareness. No petty squabbles, no wasted hours, no trifling distractions, just the relentless pursuit of what mattered. Rome didn't build roads that spanned continents or laws that outlasted centuries by accident. They built them because their leaders worked with the sand of the hourglass in full view. Now contrast that with modern life. How often do we trick ourselves into believing we have unlimited time? I'll start that business next year. I'll mend that relationship someday. I'll chase my dreams when things settle down. But the Stoics would call that delusion the greatest thief of potential. Procrastination isn't just a bad habit, it's a denial of our very nature. The empires that endured understood this. The pyramids, the Great Wall, the Sistine Chapel none were built by people who thought, I'll get to it eventually. So let's bring this home. Picture your life as an ancient Roman might, finite, fragile, fiercely precious. If this year were your last, what conversations would you finally have? What projects would you launch? What grudges would you drop? Memento Mori isn't meant to morbid, it's meant to magnify. When Steve Jobs stood before Stanford's graduating class and said, "Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered," he wasn't speaking as a CEO, he was channeling Stoic wisdom. Death doesn't make life meaningless, it makes our choices meaningful. Here's the challenge: for 1 week, place a small object on your desk, a coin, a stone, anything, and let it serve as your memento mori. Each time you see it, ask, is this how I'd spend my time if today were my legacy? Because empires weren't built by those who feared the end, but by those who let the end teach them how to truly begin. Augustus didn't just rule Rome, he rewrote its destiny by mastering a principle the Stoics called oikeiosis, the art of taking ownership of purpose. Picture this: a fractured republic, exhausted by civil war, suddenly transformed into an empire that would endure for centuries. How Augustus didn't just conquer territory, he aligned the ambitions of every citizen, from senator to soldier, with a shared vision. He rebuilt temples not as monuments, but as mirrors reflecting back to the people what they could become. This wasn't coercion, it was cultivation, and at its core lay a Stoic truth: purpose isn't found, it's forged. Seneca captured this perfectly when he wrote, "No wind favors the sailor who has no destined port." That's oikeiosis in action, the deliberate act of claiming your purpose as intimately as you'd claim your own child. The ancients understood something we often forget: aimlessness isn't freedom, it's a slow erosion of potential. Rome's engineers didn't just lay bricks, they built toward eternity. Its soldiers didn't just march, they stepped in rhythm with a civilization's heartbeat. Compare that to today's culture of endless scrolling, side hustles, and vague aspirations. How many of us drift through days without a unifying thread? Here's the stark difference. Augustus measured every policy, every speech against one question: does this make Romans proud to be Romans? He turned personal ambition into civic virtue. When he restored aqueducts, it wasn't just about water, it was about dignity. When he reformed laws, it wasn't just about order, it was about identity. Oikeiosis taught that purpose grows when rooted in something larger than yourself. So let's bring this home. Your legacy isn't some distant monument, it's the sum of your daily choices. The writer who crafts sentences with care, the teacher who sparks curiosity, the parent who models integrity, they're all practicing oikeiosis. They're not waiting for purpose to strike, they're stitching it into every action. Try this today. Pause at each decision, no matter how small, and ask, does this align with who I'm becoming? Because empires weren't built by those who chased every whim, but by those who planted their flag on a chosen path and said, "This is mine." Your life is your Rome. What will you build into its foundations? A Roman emperor once faced a rebellion so severe his advisors urged him to execute every rebel. Instead, Antoninus Pius simply said, "Better to save one citizen than to kill 1,000 enemies." That wasn't weakness, it was apatheia, the Stoic art of mastering emotions without suppressing them. Modern minds often confuse this with apathy, but the difference is everything. Apathy is numbness, apatheia is clarity. Epictetus put it bluntly: it's not events that disturb us, but our judgments about them. When barbarians threatened Rome's borders, Antoninus didn't rage or panic. He assessed, strategized, and acted free from the fog of fury. His reign became known as Rome's golden age of stability, not because he felt nothing, but because he refused to let feelings steer the empire. Now contrast that with today's outrage culture. Social media feeds thrive on knee-jerk reactions, hot takes fired off in seconds, cancel campaigns launched over misunderstandings, entire careers derailed by a single emotional tweet. The Stoics would have recognized this as the exact opposite of apatheia. When Epictetus taught, first, tell yourself what kind of person you want to be, then do what you must to stay that way. He was giving us armor against emotional hijacking. Rome's best leaders knew you can't govern an empire or your own life when every insult, setback, or provocation throws you off course. So here's the pivotal question: what emotion most often hijacks your judgment? Is it anger that clouds your decisions, anxiety that paralyzes your potential? Even ambition, untempered, can become a tyrant. The Stoics didn't demonize emotions, they disciplined them. Like a skilled rider guiding a powerful horse, apatheia is about directing energy, not denying it. Marcus Aurelius journaled about this nightly, reviewing where his emotions had overreached, not to punish himself but to refine his responses. This week, try a Roman exercise. When emotions surge, pause and ask, would Antoninus act this way? That split-second filter between stimulus and response is where empires are built or broken. Because true power isn't in never feeling, but in choosing how those feelings shape your next move. Every morning before dawn, a Roman senator would stand in his atrium, eyes closed, silently reviewing the day ahead, not just his tasks, but the quality of his attention. This ritual had a name, prosoche, the Stoic practice of mindfulness that transformed routine actions into deliberate acts of will. Musonius Rufus, the philosopher whose teachings shaped generations, put it bluntly: if you accomplish nothing worthwhile in a day, don't blame the hours, blame your lack of attention. Rome's greatest builders didn't just work hard, they worked awake. When they engineered roads, they didn't merely lay stones, they envisioned the travelers who'd walk them for centuries. That's the difference between motion and intention. Now consider the modern myth of multitasking. We pride ourselves on juggling emails, meetings, and notifications, yet studies show our brains aren't wired to split focus. The Stoics would have called this the illusion of productivity. A legionnaire didn't practice swordplay while drafting letters. A Vestal virgin tending the sacred flame didn't scroll through tablets. They understood what we've forgotten. Divided attention means diluted results. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Concentrate every minute like a Roman on doing what's in front of you with precise and genuine seriousness." Not faster, not simultaneously, fully. Here's the test. When did you last do one thing, just one, with undistracted presence? Not eating while working, not listening while planning, but giving a single act your entire focus. The Stoics recognized a truth neuroscience now confirms. Mastery and meaning emerge from depth, not fragmentation. A Roman architect designing the Pantheon didn't toggle between blueprints and gossip. A Stoic teacher like Epictetus didn't lecture while checking his sundial. They practiced prosoche, the art of attending so completely that even mundane tasks became threads in the tapestry of a purposeful life. So try this today. Pick one routine moment, your morning coffee, a walk, even a conversation, and approach it like a Stoic ritual. No background noise. No mental rehearsals for later. Just the heat of the cup, the rhythm of your steps, the weight of the words exchanged. Because empires weren't built by those who did everything at once, but by those who knew exactly what they were doing and why in each singular moment. Cato the Younger stood in his study, running his fingers along the blade of his sword one final time. Rome had fallen to Caesar's tyranny. The republic he'd sworn to protect was crumbling. And so, with stoic resolve, he chose death over dishonor, tearing open his own wounds rather than live under a dictator's rule. To modern eyes, it seems extreme. But to Cato, it was kathēkon, the unshakable duty that bound a person to their role in the cosmic order. The Stoics didn't see duty as chains, they saw it as the skeleton of civilization. When Marcus Aurelius wrote, "What benefits the hive benefits the bee," he wasn't spouting platitudes, he was describing the invisible web of obligations that held empires together: the farmer's duty to sow, the soldiers to stand fast, the leaders to serve. Rome didn't endure because of brilliant individuals. It thrived because generations of citizens, from senators to slaves, understood their kathēkon. The aqueducts that brought water to millions weren't built by freelancers chasing passion projects. The legal system that spanned continents wasn't crafted by lone geniuses. These were collective achievements born of people showing up day after day for something larger than themselves. Contrast that with today's cult of self-actualization, where following your bliss often means abandoning commitments the moment they feel inconvenient. The Stoics would argue we've confused freedom with fragmentation, that a life untethered from duty is a life adrift. Marcus Aurelius, despite his imperial power, woke each morning reminding himself of his duties not just to Rome but to humanity. Men exist for the sake of one another, he scribbled in his journal. Either teach them better or endure them. That's kathēkon in its rawest form, the recognition that your actions ripple outward, shaping families, communities, even history. When Roman engineers built bridges, they didn't just calculate load-bearing weights, they imagined generations crossing safely. When teachers in the agora debated philosophy, they weren't just entertaining students, they were stewarding civilization's memory. So here's the uncomfortable mirror this framework holds up. What responsibilities have you rationalized away? That project you have finished, the relationship you've neglected, the community role you stepped back from. What if Rome's legions had treated their posts as optional? Duty isn't about blind obedience. It's about recognizing that every role you accept, parent, partner, professional, comes with invisible threads connecting you to others. The barber who sharpens his blade before dawn, the nurse who double-checks dosages, the parent who listens instead of scrolling, these aren't small acts. They're the quiet stitching that holds the fabric of society together. Cotto's final act wasn't just about principle, it was a signal flare to future generations. Some things are worth more than survival. While none of us face his extreme choice, we all confront daily versions of it, the decision to cut corners or commit fully, to withdraw or contribute. The Stoics' genius was framing duty not as a burden but as a compass. So tonight, ask yourself, where have you been a fair-weather citizen in your own life? And what would change if you treated your roles, however humble, as sacred contracts with the world? Trajan stood atop the newly completed aqueduct, gazing at the bustling streets below, not with pride of ownership, but with quiet satisfaction. His engineers hadn't just built a waterway, they'd woven a lifeline for thousands. This was eudaimonia in action, the ancient Stoic ideal of flourishing not through personal gain, but through virtuous contribution. Aristotle, whose ideas deeply influenced Stoicism, defined it bluntly: happiness depends upon ourselves. Not our comforts, not our conquests, but our capacity to live in alignment with purpose. Rome's greatest emperors understood this. Trajan's Forum, his public baths, even the welfare system he created for poor children, these weren't vanity projects. They were the physical manifestation of a philosophy. That true fulfillment emerges when we stop chasing pleasure and start cultivating meaning. Modern culture has twisted happiness into a checklist: more money, more likes, more possessions. But the Stoics saw through this illusion 2,000 years ago. Seneca warned, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more who is poor." Think about that dichotomy. On one side, Trajan, one of history's most powerful men, finding joy in building communal latrines. On the other, today's influencers chasing endless dopamine hits while reporting record loneliness. The difference isn't in their circumstances, it's in their framework. Eudaimonia isn't about feeling good, it's about being good, and that shift changes everything. Here's the challenge hidden in this ancient wisdom. When was the last time you derived deep satisfaction from an act that served no immediate benefit to yourself? The teacher who stays late to help a struggling student, the neighbor who organizes a block cleanup, the stranger who returns a lost wallet, these aren't just nice actions. They're echoes of a Stoic truth. We flourish when we stop treating life as a pleasure hunt and start seeing it as a virtue garden. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "What benefits the hive benefits the bee." Trajan didn't build aqueducts because it made him happy in the moment. He built them because it was right, and in that rightness, he found a joy no feast or triumph could match. So pause and audit your pursuits this week. How many of your goals are about acquisition versus contribution? How many hours are spent consuming rather than creating? Eudaimonia whispers an uncomfortable truth. The path to fulfillment isn't paved with what you get, but with what you give. The Roman baths still stand today not because Trajan needed a place to wash, but because he understood, as all great builders do, that civilizations thrive when individuals see their own flourishing as inseparable from the flourishing of others. At dawn in ancient Sparta, boys as young as 7 stood barefoot in snowdrifts, not because they enjoyed suffering, but because their elders understood a truth we've forgotten. Comfort is the enemy of resilience. This was ascesis, disciplined training of body and mind, and it didn't stay confined to warrior cultures. Centuries later, the Stoics refined it into a philosophy of voluntary hardship. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, despite ruling the known world, slept on a thin pallet and trained in wrestling daily. Hadrian, another philosopher king, marched 20 miles in full armor with his troops, not for show, but to prove a point. Leadership isn't conferred by privilege, it's forged through self-imposed challenges. Epictetus, the former slave turned Stoic master, put it bluntly, difficulties show men what they are. His students weren't allowed cushioned chairs in lectures, they sat on hard stone. Why? Because he knew luxury dulls the senses, while deliberate discomfort sharpens them. Modern science now confirms this. Studies on cold exposure, fasting, and physical endurance reveal what the ancients intuited. Controlled stress doesn't break us, it rebuilds us stronger. The Spartans didn't create legendary warriors by coddling. The Stoics didn't produce unshakable minds by avoiding discomfort. Both cultures thrived because they treated discipline as a daily dialogue with their limits. Now consider today's paradox. We have more conveniences than any civilization in history, yet rates of anxiety and fragility soar. Smartphones deliver food to our doors while delivering dopamine hits to our brains. Algorithms shield us from opposing viewpoints. Thermostats ensure we never feel a chill. But here's the question Epictetus would ask. If you've never faced resistance, how do you know what you're capable of? Rome's legions didn't train on flat terrain, they drilled on rocky hills. Musonius Rufus made his students build their own school benches, not to save money, but to teach that effort precedes mastery. So let's make this personal. What's your version of that Spartan snowdrift? It might be physical, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, turning the shower cold for 30 seconds, or carrying groceries home instead of driving. Or mental, reading a book that challenges your beliefs before reaching for another comfort scroll. Emotional, having that difficult conversation you've been avoiding instead of numbing the tension with distractions. Ascesis isn't about masochism, it's about reclaiming agency. Every time you choose discomfort over convenience, you're not just building resilience, you're rehearsing for life's inevitable storms. The Stoics had a practice called premeditatio malorum, imagining worst-case scenarios not to fear them, but to prove they could endure them. Try this today. Identify one comfort you'll voluntarily surrender this week. No grand gestures needed. Start small, but start, because history's most enduring empires weren't built by those who sought ease. but by those who understood discipline is the currency of freedom. Hadrian didn't just rule the Roman Empire, he transformed it through a principle the Stoics called Philanthropia, the art of leading with enlightened generosity. Picture this, an emperor who traveled to every province not to extract wealth, but to fund libraries, theaters, and temples. When Athens lay in ruins, Hadrian didn't just rebuild its structures, he restored its soul, commissioning aqueducts, baths, and even completing the temple of Olympian Zeus, a project stalled for 6 centuries. This wasn't vanity, it was philanthropia in action. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher who advised Nero, captured the spirit perfectly. Wherever there is a human being, there is an opportunity for kindness. Rome's greatest leaders understood that true power wasn't measured in territory conquered, but in lives elevated. Now contrast that with modern leadership. Too often, generosity becomes transactional corporate donations for tax breaks, philanthropy as PR strategy, aid tied to political strings. The Stoics would have called this a corruption of philanthropia. Hadrian didn't fund Athenian schools to win votes. He did it because flourishing cities made a flourishing empire. Marcus Aurelius later wrote, "What benefits the hive benefits the bee." When Trajan established Alimenta, a welfare system for poor children, he wasn't seeking applause, he was investing in Rome's future. That's the difference between giving to get and giving to lift. Here's the uncomfortable question. Where in your life could you replace transactional thinking with true philanthropia? It might not mean building temples, but what about mentoring a colleague without expecting credit? Or supporting a cause anonymously? Even small acts, listening deeply instead of waiting to speak, sharing knowledge freely rather than hoarding it, carry the spirit of Stoic generosity. The architect who designs public parks, the teacher who stays late for struggling students, the neighbor who organizes a community garden, they're all practicing philanthropia. Seneca left us a litmus test. He who gives quickly gives twice, not just speed but intention. When you help, is it to check a box or to ignite potential? Hadrian's libraries still stand today not because he needed monuments, but because he believed knowledge should belong to everyone. So ask yourself today, what's one way you could lead, whether in your home, workplace, or community, not from a place of scarcity, but from a wellspring of genuine goodwill? Because empires weren't sustained by takers, they thrived when leaders understood that the highest form of power is the willingness to empower others. Diogenes lounged in his barrel under the Athenian sun, watching as Alexander the Great himself approached. When the conqueror asked if the philosopher wanted anything, Diogenes simply replied, "Yes, step aside, you're blocking my light." This wasn't just cheek, it was autarkeia in action, the Stoic art of radical self-sufficiency that taught empires how to endure. While kings built palaces, Diogenes proved one could flourish with nothing but a wooden tub and unwavering principles. But here's what modern retellings miss. His barrel wasn't about poverty, it was about freedom. By stripping life to its essentials, he exposed a truth Rome later institutionalized. Stockpiling resources means nothing without the wisdom to use them well. The Stoic teacher Musonius Rufus took this further, arguing that frugality wasn't deprivation, it was advanced training. How can a man rule others if he can't rule his own desires? He'd challenge his students. Rome took this seriously. Their granaries weren't just filled with wheat, they stored knowledge. Public libraries stood beside aqueducts, ensuring citizens could feed minds as reliably as bodies. When barbarians sacked cities, survivors rebuilt not because they hoarded gold, but because they'd internalized autarkeia, the ability to create value from within. Contrast that with today's consumerist treadmill, where convenience often means outsourcing our basic competencies. We can't cook without meal kits, navigate without GPS, or entertain ourselves without endless streaming. The Stoics would ask, what happens when the systems we depend on fail? Marcus Aurelius journaled about this tension between wants and needs. Very little is needed to make a happy life. Not nothing, very little. The distinction matters. Rome's frontier farmers didn't abandon tools, but they mastered skills to repair them. Soldiers carried emergency rations, but also trained to forage. This balanced approach to possessing resources while transcending dependence on them became their resilience blueprint. So here's the piercing question Diogenes forces us to confront. What's your barrel? Not literally, but psychologically. What comforts have you confused for necessities? The entrepreneur who can't work without premium software, the parent reliant on endless gadgets to soothe children, the student who panics without Wi-Fi. These are modern variations of the same trap. Oikeiosis suggests an experiment. For 1 week, identify one essential you'll voluntarily relinquish. Cook from scratch, navigate a trip without apps. Read physical books, like a Roman legionary testing his gear before battle. You're not preparing for collapse, you're proving to yourself that true security comes from adaptability, not stockpiles. Because history's great civilizations didn't collapse when they lost wealth, they fell when they forgot how to thrive without it. Diogenes' barrel still rolls through time, asking, how much lighter could you move if you carried only what you truly need? When Nero's reign ended in flames, Rome faced a choice: fracture into warring factions or rediscover the glue that had once bound them. This wasn't just about peace, it was homonoia, the ancient Stoic ideal of concord built not on enforced silence, but on shared recognition of our common humanity. Marcus Aurelius, reflecting years later, wrote, "What brings no benefit to the hive brings none to the bee." Notice he didn't say agreement, he said benefit. Rome's greatest leaders understood unity wasn't about uniformity. It was about aligning diverse voices toward a purpose larger than any individual. Consider the year of the 4 emperors, 12 months of civil war that nearly shattered the empire. What restored stability wasn't military might alone, but Vespasian's deliberate revival of homonoia. He didn't purge dissenters, he rebuilt the Capitoline Temple as a symbol of collective identity. When barbarians threatened, Romans didn't rally because they shared opinions, they rallied because they shared streets, schools, and a stake in something bigger. The Stoics framed this as an extension of sympatheia, recognizing conflict as inevitable, but concord as a choice. Fast forward to today's polarized landscapes: political, social, even familial. We've mistaken homonoia for echo chambers, demanding ideological purity rather than seeking shared foundations. Marcus Aurelius warned against this. When people injure you, ask what good or harm they thought would come of it. You'll find compassion easier once you understand their why. The architect who designed the Colosseum didn't share the gladiator's worldview, but he ensured the structure served both spectators and combatants. That's the essence of concord: building spaces where differing purposes can coexist. Here's the practice hidden in this framework. Next time you're locked in disagreement, pause and ask, what's the deeper need beneath our positions? The protester and the policeman both want safety. The entrepreneur and the regulator both value prosperity. Rome's legal system thrived because it distinguished values from methods, allowing Gauls to keep local customs while adopting Roman law. So try this today. Identify one person in your life who sees the world differently and find one shared principle beneath the friction. Maybe it's caring for the same community or wanting better opportunities for your children. Homonoia doesn't require compromise, it demands clarity about what's truly worth uniting over. Because empires didn't endure by eliminating differences, but by directing them toward common horizons. Julius Caesar stood at the banks of the Rubicon, his legions tense behind him. Crossing this shallow river meant treason, civil war, the point of no return. But Caesar understood something most leaders forget: the difference between recklessness and kairos, the Stoic art of opportune action. He didn't rush blindly. He'd spent years preparing for this moment. The Gaulish campaigns hardened his troops, his political alliances secured key cities, and now, with Pompey's forces scattered, the clock of fate ticked louder than ever. "The die is cast," he murmured, not as a gambler, but as a strategist who'd waited for the hinge of history to swing his way. This is where Stoic timing diverges from modern haste. Cleans, the philosopher who kept Zeno's school alive, taught that kairos wasn't about speed, it was about synchronization. "Know the tides," he'd say, "and you'll never row against the current." Think of a farmer planting seeds. Sow too early, frost kills the shoots. Too late, summer steals the rain. Rome's generals didn't win battles by charging at first sight of the enemy. They watched for the moment formations frayed, when the sun blinded opponents, when morale tipped like a scale. That's kairos, action married to opportunity. Now consider your own life. How many times have you delayed a difficult conversation until tensions festered, hesitated on a career move until the role vanished? The Stoics recognized a cruel truth: missed opportunities rarely announce themselves. They slip away like sand through fingers, leaving only "what if" in their wake. Seneca lamented this in his letters: "While we postpone, life speeds by." Not every Rubicon needs crossing, but when the current of circumstance aligns with your preparation, hesitation becomes its own form of recklessness. Here's the litmus test Cleans would pose. What's been lingering in your mental backlog, waiting for a perfect moment that never comes? That business idea you've researched but haven't launched. The apology you've drafted in your head but never voiced. Even Caesar's legendary swiftness, marching his legions 96 miles in 4 days, wasn't impulsive. It was the culmination of disciplined readiness meeting undeniable timing. So try this exercise tonight. List 3 decisions you've postponed. Next to each, write the real cost of delay. Not in abstract terms, but tangible impacts: relationships strained, growth stunted, doors slowly closing. Kairos whispers that the right moment isn't when conditions are perfect, but when the cost of waiting outweighs the risk of acting. The Rubicon wasn't special because it was deep. It was significant because crossing it meant everything. Your decisive moment may not change empires, but it could alter the trajectory of your life. The question isn't whether you'll face your Rubicon, it's whether you'll recognize it when the water reaches your knees. Alexander the Great wept when he realized there were no more worlds to conquer. A man who'd crossed the known earth, drunk from its riches, and still found himself hollow. His tutor Aristotle had warned him about excess, but the lesson didn't stick. Contrast that with Marcus Aurelius, who ruled the Roman Empire at its zenith yet wrote in his private journal, "Enough is so much more than a feast." This was apatheia, the Stoic practice of measured emotion and moderation that separated rulers who built legacies from those who burned through them. Seneca, the philosopher who watched Nero's unchecked appetites destroy Rome from within, put it bluntly: "No man was ever wise by chance. Temperance is a virtue that must be cultivated like a garden." The Stoics didn't preach austerity for its own sake. Their emperors still enjoyed fine wine, commissioned art, and celebrated victories. But they understood something Alexander forgot: every pleasure has a threshold beyond which it becomes poison. Trajan hosted lavish games but personally ate simple soldiers' rations. Hadrian collected Greek sculptures but slept on a plain camp bed. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was training. By deliberately leaving room between their capacity for indulgence and their actual consumption, They kept their desires in service of their purpose, not the other way around. Now zoom into modern life where burnout and binge cycles dominate. We glorify hustle culture until exhaustion crashes into Netflix marathons and impulse buys. Social media serves us endless scrolls of curated excess luxury hauls, extreme diets, toxic productivity. The Stoics would recognize this as metriopatheia's opposite, a life swinging wildly between deprivation and overindulgence without ever finding center. Seneca saw it coming 2,000 years ago. It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more who is poor. Here's the piercing question this framework forces us to confront. Where in your life have you lost the balance between enough and excess? Is it in work, grinding through weekends only to collapse into wasted vacations? In consumption, swinging between restrictive budgets and reckless spending? Even knowledge itself can become an intoxicant when we endlessly collect books, courses, and podcasts without applying any of it. The Stoic solution isn't to eliminate pleasure, but to master it. Like a chef who tastes but doesn't gorge, or a vintner who sips without drowning, try this experiment today. Pick one area where you've been oscillating between extremes, maybe screen time, caffeine, or emotional reactions. For 1 week, impose a single intentional constraint. If you're a workaholic, leave the office at 5 sharp one day. If you're a chronic scroller, set a timer for 20 minutes of leisure reading instead. The goal isn't to punish enjoyment, but to prove to yourself that you can hold the reins, because empires and individuals crumble when they can't tell the difference between a tool and a tyrant. The same fire that cooks the stew can burn down the house. Metriopatheia asks, are you tending the flame or being consumed by it? Augustus found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, not for vanity, but because he understood philakalea, the Stoic love of beauty, as moral discipline. Walk through the ruins of his forum today, and you'll notice something striking. The columns aren't just sturdy, they're harmonious. The proportions follow the golden ratio, the same mathematical perfection found in seashells and galaxies. This wasn't decoration, it was philosophy in stone. Plotinus, the neo-Stoic thinker, later wrote, "Beauty is the splintered light of the divine." Augustus' architects weren't just building monuments, they were crafting mirrors to reflect the order of the cosmos itself. Consider the Pantheon, its dome engineered so precisely that rain forms a perfect column of vapor rising through the oculus. The Stoics saw such beauty not as luxury, but as virtue made visible. When Seneca described his ideal home, he didn't list gold trimmings or exotic woods. He wrote of windows placed to greet the sun, gardens where herbs and wisdom grow side by side. Functional beauty, to the Stoic mind, was a daily reminder that excellence isn't reserved for grand moments. It's woven into the fabric of ordinary life. Now contrast that with modern spaces. We've split beauty into two camps, sterile minimalism or cluttered excess. The first leaves us starved for warmth, the second for clarity. But philakalea suggests a third path, the mindful curation of environments that elevate rather than simply decorate. The Japanese concept of wabi-sabi comes close, finding beauty in weathered wood, in the patina of a well-used tool, in asymmetry that tells a story. Marcus Aurelius would have approved. His meditations mention the charm of a loaf's cracks as it bakes, the dignity of an old tree's gnarled branches. Here's the challenge hidden in this framework. What's one corner of your world that could bear the touch of philakalea? Maybe it's your workspace, not with expensive art, but with purposeful arrangement. A single potted herb on the desk, a notebook bound in tactile leather, a lamp placed to cast gentle shadows instead of harsh glare. Or consider your digital spaces, replacing chaotic screenshots with a curated wallpaper that sparks focus. pruning apps until only those serving genuine purpose remain. Plotinus argued that beauty whispers truths the logical mind can't hear. The next time you pass a well-designed bridge or pause before a sunset, ask yourself, what's being communicated here? Is it symmetry suggesting stability, color stirring courage, space inviting contemplation? Augustus didn't marble Rome to impress tourists, he did it to shape citizens. Because when you walk through grandeur daily, you begin to expect it of yourself. That's the alchemy of Philanthropia. It turns aesthetics into ethics, surroundings into teachers. Your environment isn't just where you live, it's what silently convinces you of what's possible. Olympia's mother of Alexander the Great once warned her son with a chilling prophecy: no kingdom can survive a king who cannot rule himself. She wasn't just speaking about power, she was describing sophrosyne, the ancient Stoic virtue of temperance that separated legendary leaders from tyrants who burned through their own empires. Consider the Roman Emperor Tiberius, who retreated to Capri's pleasure palaces, indulging in increasingly depraved appetites until even his own guards revolted. Now contrast that with Marcus Aurelius, who despite absolute power, maintained a daily discipline of philosophy, physical training, and simple meals. Both men inherited the same throne. One left Rome stronger, the other left it poisoned. The difference wasn't in their authority, but in their self-rule. Epictetus, the former slave-turned-Stoic teacher, framed this starkly: no man is free who is not master of himself. His students, Rome's future senators and generals, didn't just study logic, they practiced resisting comforts. Cold baths instead of warm, plain bread instead of feasts, not because pleasure was evil, but because unbridled desire was a silent coup waiting to happen. Modern neuroscience confirms what the Stoics intuited. Our brains wire themselves around whatever we feed them. The more you indulge a craving, whether for sugar, screens, or validation, the stronger its grip becomes. Sophrosyne was their antidote, the deliberate practice of saying enough while you still could. Now zoom into today's world of infinite temptation. Social media algorithms exploit dopamine loops. Food engineers design snacks to bypass satiety signals. Entire industries profit by eroding our self-command. The Stoics would argue we're not weak, we're outmatched. When Seneca wrote, "The greatest wealth is a poverty of desires," he wasn't preaching austerity. He was offering a survival tactic for a culture drowning in excess. Here's the piercing question Olympias forces us to confront. What craving controls you? Is it the reflexive reach for your phone upon waking, the inability to pause after one drink? The rush of online purchases that leave your closet full but your soul empty? Sophrosyne suggests a radical experiment. For 1 week, identify one appetite you'll deliberately restrain. Skip the snooze button, walk past the bakery without stopping, leave the last bite on your plate. Like a Roman senator training for crisis by wearing coarse wool under his toga, you're not denying pleasure, you're proving to yourself that you dictate the terms. Because history's clearest lesson is this: the conquerors of nations rarely fell to external enemies. They rotted from within, their wills eroded by indulgences they once believed they controlled. The Stoics didn't practice temperance to impress the gods, they did it to remain free. And in a world of engineered addiction, that freedom might be the most rebellious act left. Marcus Aurelius knelt by the riverbank, watching water striders skim the surface without breaking the tension that held them afloat. To most, it was just a moment of quiet. To him, it was eusebia, the Stoic practice of piety redefined not as blind ritual, but as reverence for the invisible laws binding the universe. Everything is interwoven, he wrote, and the web is sacred. This wasn't about appeasing capricious gods, it was recognizing nature as the ultimate operating system. Hierocles, another Stoic thinker, expanded this further. Just as limbs serve the body, so must we serve the cosmos. Imagine living with that awareness, seeing your daily choices as threads in a grander design. Modern minds often recoil at the word piety, associating it with rigid dogma or hollow tradition. But the Stoics meant something radically different. Their sympatheia was a deep respect for cause and effect, for the responsibilities embedded in existence itself. When Roman engineers studied watersheds to place aqueducts, they weren't just solving logistical problems, they were honoring the pact between civilization and nature. Compare that to today's alienation, where we bulldoze forests for subdivisions yet wonder why seasonal floods worsen. The Stoics would argue we've lost the humility to see ourselves as participants rather than conquerors. Marcus left us a clue in his meditations. What doesn't benefit the hive doesn't benefit the bee. Notice he didn't say the hive or the bee. He recognized their fates as inseparable. That's sympatheia at work, the farmer rotating crops to preserve soil, the programmer writing clean code for future maintainers, the parent teaching children to repair rather than discard. Reverence for order manifests in actions that sustain systems beyond our lifespan. Here's the challenge hiding in this ancient framework. What webs do you rely on that deserve your conscious stewardship? Maybe it's the local watershed providing your drinking water, the open-source software powering your devices, or even the unspoken social contracts that keep your community safe. Sympatheia asks us to move through the world like gardeners, tending, mending, and giving back to the networks that nourish us, because empires didn't endure by exploiting. They thrived when citizens understood that the highest form of worship is preservation. Tiberius stalked the marble halls of his Capri villa, surrounded by wealth and whispers, yet utterly enslaved by his own paranoia and appetites. History remembers him as Rome's recluse emperor, a man who wielded absolute power like a child swinging a sword blindly, destructively, leaving scars that outlasted his reign. Now contrast that with Marcus Aurelius, who inherited the same imperial authority, but used it to fund orphanages, reform laws, and personally answer petitions from common citizens. The difference between these two rulers wasn't in the extent of their power, but in their understanding of dynamis, the Stoic art of managing influence as sacred stewardship rather than personal privilege. Seneca, who witnessed Nero's descent into tyranny firsthand, penned a warning that cuts across centuries. No soul is virtuous that does not consider itself watched, not by neighbors, but by the divine. He wasn't speaking of supernatural surveillance, but of the accountability woven into true leadership. The Stoics framed power as a loan from fate, not a possession. When a Roman general triumphed in battle, a slave stood behind him during his victory parade, whispering Memento Mori, reminding him that glory was fleeting and responsibility eternal. That ritual wasn't theater, it was psychological training for dynamis. Modern workplaces and governments overflow with Tiberius figures, executives who hoard information to feel important, politicians who treat public trust as personal piggy banks. But the Aurelian model still thrives where you least expect it. Consider the restaurant owner who shares profits with dishwashers during lean months, or the tech CEO who transparently documents decision-making for junior employees. These aren't just nice gestures, they're living examples of dynamis, the recognition that influence multiplies when circulated wisely. Here's the uncomfortable mirror this framework holds up. How does your own power, whether over a team, a family budget, or even your daily schedule, tend to manifest? Is it clenched like a fist or open like a bridge? The Stoics measured leadership by a simple metric. Does your authority enlarge others or merely inflate yourself? When Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The fruit of power is service," He wasn't virtue signaling, he was describing the physics of enduring impact. So try this exercise today. Map your spheres of influence. Not just job titles or bank balances, but subtler levers: who listens when you speak, whose opportunities depend on your fairness. Then ask Seneca's defining question: if all could see my private use of power, would I stand taller or cringe? Because history's clearest lesson is this: dynasties don't fall from lack of strength, but from forgetting that dynamis was never truly theirs to keep. For 20 centuries, these mental frameworks didn't just survive, they enabled societies to thrive through plagues, invasions, and the rise and fall of empires. The Stoic principles we've explored weren't philosophical abstractions. They were the operating system for builders, leaders, and citizens who shaped history. Rome's aqueducts, legal systems, and cultural cohesion didn't emerge by accident. They were the physical manifestations of apatheia, oikeiosis, and homonoia, proof that resilience isn't inherited but cultivated. Consider how these ideas functioned as societal immune systems. When barbarians breached the walls, amor fati turned panic into strategy. When resources dwindled, autarkeia transformed scarcity into innovation. And when internal strife threatened unity, sympatheia reminded citizens they were limbs of the same body. Modern psychology now validates what the Stoics practiced. Cultures that master emotional discipline, shared purpose, and adaptive thinking don't just endure chaos, they harness it as fuel. The difference between a flourishing civilization and a failed state often boils down to whether its people see obstacles as curses or catalysts. Marcus Aurelius left us a compass in his final writings: what benefits the hive benefits the bee. This wasn't poetic fluff, it was the cornerstone of empire building. Every road laid, every law passed, every temple raised succeeded when individuals aligned personal growth with collective progress. Today, we face different challenges: digital distraction, societal polarization, environmental crises, but the antidote remains the same. The Stoics would argue our world isn't more complex. We've just forgotten how to apply timeless frameworks to modern contexts. Here's your invitation. This week, resurrect one principle. Start small but start concrete. If premeditatio malorum calls to you, spend 10 minutes scripting responses to a fear you've avoided. If Philanthropia resonates, perform one act of generosity without expectation or announcement. These aren't self-help hacks. They're the same mental drills that once steadied hands holding both quills and swords. The thread connecting ancient Rome to your life right now isn't history, it's human nature. The same storms that tested their character still rage today in different forms. But the anchors remain unchanged. Want to explore more of these anchors? Join our community by subscribing. We're unpacking timeless wisdom to navigate modern chaos, one Stoic principle at a time. Because the best way to predict the future is to reclaim what worked for 2,000 years. The choice, as always, is yours.